Sweat dried cold against Josephine's collarbone. The metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, smelling faintly of old copper and panic. She wasn't angry yet, just brutally, profoundly tired. The rookie holding her arms thought he'd caught a loudmouth. He had no idea he'd just unpinned a grenade. Rain fell in thick, lazy sheets across the asphalt, pooling in the potholes of the 24-hour gas-and-go. Josephine sat behind the wheel of her 2014 Volvo station wagon, a car she kept specifically because it was invisible. She stared through the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. It was 2:14 a.m. Her flight from Ramstein had landed 6 hours ago, and jet lag had settled behind her eyes like crushed glass. She just wanted a bottle of generic ibuprofen and maybe a violently artificial cherry slushy. She wore faded grey sweatpants and an oversized navy midshipman hoodie that belonged to her late brother. No stars, no ribbons, no brass. Just a 52-year-old black woman with her hair pulled back into a messy, unraveling knot, sitting in a dimly lit parking lot in Virginia. Red and blue light suddenly flooded the cabin. It bounced off the rearview mirror, harsh and blinding, painting her tired face in alternating neon strokes. Josephine didn't jump. Her pulse didn't spike. Instead, a dull, familiar weight dropped into the pit of her stomach. It was an old muscle memory, older than her commission, older than her first deployment. It was the ancestral bracing for impact. She shifted the car into park and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the patter of rain on the roof and the low, aggressive rumble of the police cruiser's engine idling right behind her bumper. Gravel crunched. Heavy boots walked deliberately slow. She rolled the window down before the flashlight hit her eyes. The beam was a physical assault, a high-lumen interrogation that made her squint and turn her head slightly. The smell of wet wool, cheap aftershave, and damp leather drifted into the car. License and registration. The voice was young, flat-scraped, entirely clean of courtesy. "Good evening, officer," Josephine said. Her voice was an alto, naturally resonant, a voice trained to project over the roar of helicopter rotors. But right now she kept it modulated, low, neutral. Was I speeding in the parking lot? I didn't ask for a conversation. License and registration. The flashlight beam dropped slightly, illuminating the interior of her car. It lingered on the empty fast food wrappers on the passenger side, the crumpled receipts, the utterly mundane clutter of civilian life. Josephine moved slowly. She telegraphed every twitch. "My wallet is in my purse on the passenger floorboard. I'm going to reach for it." "Make it quick," a second voice barked from the darkness just behind the B-pillar. An older cop, the veteran, the one training the rookie holding the flashlight. She leaned over, feeling the familiar twinge in her lower back, a souvenir from a hard landing in Kandahar 12 years ago. Her fingers brushed the worn leather of her purse. She extracted the small wallet, pulled out her Virginia driver's license, and held it out the window. She purposefully did not pull her DOD Common Access card. Not yet. She wanted to see how this played out. Call it a morbid sociological curiosity, or just the stubborn pride of a woman who was tired of needing a piece of plastic to prove she deserved basic human respect. The rookie whose name tag read Bradley snatched the license. He examined it under his light. "Josephine Hayes. What are you doing out here at 2 a.m? Josephine." She hated the casual use of her first name. It was a subtle, immediate stripping of dignity. "I was just about to go inside and buy some ibuprofen." "You sure you aren't waiting for someone?" Officer Bradley leaned closer. The smell of peppermint gum masked the stale coffee on his breath. "Lot of drug activity in this parking lot. You fit a profile?" Josephine exhaled slowly through her nose. The air in the car suddenly felt too thick to breathe. "A profile?" she asked, the neutrality slipping just a fraction of an inch, revealing the hard steel beneath. "And what profile is that exactly? A middle-aged woman in a station wagon. What's your tone?" The older cop, Mitchell, she saw his badge, now stepped up, standing shoulder to shoulder with Bradley. Mitchell had tired eyes and a jaw set in permanent annoyance. "He asked you a simple question." "And I gave him a simple answer," Josephine replied, leaning back into her seat. She didn't break eye contact with Mitchell. She had stared down warlords, hostile Senate subcommittees, and two different presidents. The glare of a suburban beat cop didn't even register on her Richter scale of intimidation. But to them, a lack of fear was a provocation. "Step out of the vehicle," Mitchell commanded. Josephine stopped. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming a chaotic rhythm on the hood. "Excuse me. On what grounds I haven't committed a traffic violation? My car is parked." I said step out of the car. "Now." Bradley's hand dropped to his duty belt. Not his gun, but his taser. The snap of the holster was a distinct, ugly sound in the wet night. She looked at that hand. She looked at the pale, tense knuckles. The absurdity of it tasted like ash in her mouth. She could say it. She could say General. She could end it right now. But a cold, rigid defiance locked her jaw. Why should she have to invoke a 4-star rank to avoid being dragged out of a car in the rain? "Officer Josephine," said her voice, dropping an octave, carrying the absolute authority she used when ordering airstrikes. "You are making a significant procedural error. I suggest you hand me back my license and return to your vehicle." Bradley's face flushed. The flashlight trembled slightly. "Are you refusing a lawful order?" "I am questioning an unlawful one," she countered. "That's it." Mitchell reached through the open window, grabbed the door handle from the inside, and yanked it open. "Out! Now!" Josephine didn't resist physically. She unbuckled her seatbelt with agonizing slowness, her movements deliberate, almost insulting in their lack of urgency. She stepped out into the rain. The cold water soaked instantly through her thin sweatpants. The chill was shocking, but she kept her posture completely rigid. She stood at 5'9", but right now she seemed to take up all the oxygen in the space between the cars. "Turn around. Put your hands on the roof of the car." Bradley was practically spitting to the words, his adrenaline spiking. He was feeding off her calm, misinterpreting it as insolence. She slowly turned. She placed her palms flat on the cold, wet roof of the Volvo. The metal was slick beneath her skin. "You're making a mistake, officer," she said to the dark glass of her own windows. "Shut up!" Bradley snapped. He grabbed her left wrist. His grip was entirely too tight, clumsy, and fueled by ego. He yanked her arm behind her back, with enough force to strain her rotator cuff. Josephine gasped a sharp intake of wet air. It wasn't pain. It was the sheer, breathtaking indignity of it. Metal bit into flesh. The handcuffs ratcheted tight, one click too many. The sound of the lock engaging was a sharp, final snick that echoed louder than the rain. Josephine's shoulders were pinned backward in an unnatural arch. The cold steel felt shocking against the warm skin of her wrists. She stood there, rain matting her hair against her skull water, running down the back of her neck, soaking into the collar of the hoodie. Bradley held onto the chain between her wrists, pulling slightly upward to keep her off balance. It was a textbook compliance hold, executed with sloppy, unnecessary malice. "Spread your legs," Mitchell ordered, his voice right by her ear. She felt the toe of his heavy boot kick her left ankle outward. The wet asphalt slipped beneath her sneaker. She caught her balance, her jaw locked so tight, her teeth ached. She submitted to the pat-down, the rough, degrading slide of hands, checking her pockets, finding nothing but lint and a crumpled tissue. "What are you arresting me for?" Josephine asked. Her voice didn't waver. It was dead calm, a terrifying kind of quiet. "Resisting," Bradley said quickly, almost breathlessly. "Failure to comply, disorderly conduct. Take your pick." Talking back, she thought. The actual charge is contempt of cop. They marched her to the cruiser. The back door opened, releasing the smell of the interior, a nauseating cocktail of chemical disinfectant, old sweat, and the faint, sour tang of vomit that no amount of scrubbing could ever completely remove. Mitchell put a hand on top of her head to guide her down. She resisted the urge to snap her neck away from his touch. She ducked and slid into the molded plastic seat. It was freezing inside. The plastic was hard and unyielding. With her hands cuffed behind her, she had to sit awkwardly perched forward, her spine curving painfully to accommodate her trapped arms. The heavy door slammed shut. The sound was thick, isolating. It sealed her in a cage. Through the plexiglass divider, she watched Bradley and Mitchell stand in the rain by her car. They were laughing. Mitchell clapped Bradley on the shoulder. They were utterly unbothered. To them, she was just a piece of trash they had swept off their beat. A quota fulfilled. An ego stroked. They spent another 10 minutes casually tossing the interior of her Volvo, looking for drugs that didn't exist, shining their flashlights under the seats and in the glove box. They didn't find the military ID she kept tucked in the hidden zipper compartment of her purse. They just tossed the bag back onto the floorboard. Eventually they climbed into the front of the cruiser. The heater blasted on, smelling of burning dust. "All right, Josephine," Mitchell said, looking at her in the rearview mirror. His eyes were dark, devoid of empathy. "Let's go take a ride. Maybe you'll learn some manners by the time we process you." The drive to the precinct took 20 minutes. Josephine spent it staring out the window at the blurred neon streaks of the suburban strip malls. The vibration of the road traveled up through the hard plastic seat, settling in her aching shoulders. She focused on her breathing. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The box breathing technique they taught in SERE school. She had used it while waiting for extraction in a hostile valley in Helmand. She was using it now in the back of a Ford Explorer in Virginia. The precinct was a cinder-block fortress that smelled aggressively of pine sol and stale coffee. The harsh, flickering fluorescent lights overhead gave everything an exhausted, sickly pallor. They hauled her out of the cruiser and frog-marched her through the double-glass doors. The booking area was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shouting officers, and the low, defeated murmurs of people sitting on wooden benches, waiting for their turn at the desk. "Got a live one, Sarge," Mitchell called out as they approached the raised booking desk. The booking sergeant, a heavy-set man with a receding hairline and a mustard stain on his tie, barely looked up from his computer monitor. "Name, Hayes Josephine," Bradley said, slapping her driver's license onto the counter. "Brought her in for disorderly and failure to comply. Gave us a hard time at the gas and go. Take her cuffs off. Put her in holding cell 3 until I'm ready to process the paperwork." The sergeant mumbled, finally glancing down at her. He didn't see a person. He saw paperwork. "Take her shoelaces and anything in her pockets." Bradley grabbed her arm, spinning her around to unlock the cuffs. When the metal finally released, Josephine let out a long, shaky breath. Her wrists were deeply indented, the skin raw and chafed red. She slowly brought her arms forward, rubbing the circulation back into her numb fingers. "Shoes." Bradley pointed at her sneakers. Josephine bent down. Her lower back screamed. She untied her shoes, pulled out the laces, and handed them over. She stood back up, looking at the 3 men. "I am legally entitled to a phone call," she said. Her voice cut through the background noise of the precinct. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a specific frequency that demanded attention. The sergeant sighed, rubbing his eyes. Yeah. After you're processed, go sit in the cell. No, Josephine said. She planted her feet. I am not processing anything until I make a call. I need my phone. Mitchell stepped forward, towering over her. Listen, lady, you don't make the rules here. You'll get your call when we say you get your call. Josephine looked at Mitchell, really looked at him. She saw the fraying threads on his collar, the slight tremor in his hand, the absolute certainty of his own tiny kingdom. Officer Mitchell, she said softly, stepping half a pace toward him, invading his space, just enough to make him blink. My phone is in the right pocket of my sweatpants. I am going to reach in, take it out, and make a call. If you try to stop me, the next person walking through those double doors is going to be a federal attorney with a detachment of military police. Do you understand me? The precinct suddenly went very quiet. The phones kept ringing, but the cops had stopped talking. The pure, unadulterated command in her voice had frozen them. It was a tone they recognized, an alpha predator tone that they usually reserved for themselves. Hearing it from a disheveled black woman in wet sweatpants short-circuited their brains. Bradley looked at Mitchell. Mitchell looked at the sergeant. Before they could react, Josephine slipped her hand into her pocket. She pulled out her sleek, government-issued smartphone. The screen illuminated her face, casting sharp shadows under her eyes. She didn't dial a lawyer. She didn't dial a bail bondsman. She bypassed the lock screen with a thumbprint, opened her contacts, and tapped a number saved only as desk, NMCC, the National Military Command Center. The Pentagon. She held the phone to her ear. It rang exactly once. Command Center Captain Davies speaking. Authentication required. Captain. Josephine said, her eyes locked on Officer Mitchell's pale face. This is General Josephine Hayes. Authentication code Echo Victor 907. I have a situation. How would you like to proceed with the story? Davies didn't miss a beat. The voice on the other end of the line shifted instantly from administrative monotone to razor-sharp operational readiness. Authentication confirmed, General Hayes. Secure line established. What is your status and location? The silence in the booking room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet, the sort that usually precedes a detonation. The only sound was the rhythmic, rattling hum of a dying HVAC unit somewhere in the ceiling, pushing stale air through a vent covered in a decade of grey dust. I am currently detained at a civilian police precinct, Josephine said, her tone level stripped of any inflection. She read the address off a laminated emergency evacuation map pinned to the bulletin board behind the booking desk. I need the duty JAG officer from Fort Belvoir, a detachment of military police, and someone to wake up the garrison commander. Have them route a federal liaison down here. Now, copy that, General. Units will be mobilized immediately. Are you injured? Do you require medical transport? Josephine looked down at her wrists. The red grooves left by the cuffs were already swelling, turning a dark, bruised purple against her dark skin. Her lower back throbbed a dull, rhythmic warning. Negative on medical. Just get them here, Davies. Tell them to bring a vehicle. My car was abandoned at a gas station by the arresting officers. Understood, ma'am. ETA is 20 minutes. Keep this line open if possible. I'll be waiting. Josephine lowered the phone, though she didn't end the call. She let her arm drop to her side. Mitchell broke the paralysis first. His face, previously flushed with the easy arrogance of assumed authority, now mottled with a defensive, ugly red. He took a jerky step forward, his hand hovering over his utility belt. Who the hell do you think you're talking to give me that phone? You don't just make up some fake military garbage in my house. He reached for her. He didn't make it halfway. Josephine didn't raise her hands. She didn't adopt a fighting stance. She simply shifted her weight, squaring her shoulders in the damp, clinging fabric of her ruined hoodie, and fixed him with a stare so utterly vacant of fear that it acted like a physical wall. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice dropping to a gravelly register that reverberated in the small room. "If you touch me again, the charges against you will elevate from civil rights violations to the assault of a senior military officer. I strongly advise you to keep your hands to yourself." Mitchell froze. The sheer audacity of her stillness confused his adrenaline. Bullies understand resistance. They thrive on it. They understand cowering. They do not understand being looked at like a mildly irritating smudge on a windshield. Behind the elevated desk, the booking sergeant, his name tag read, Briggs, was staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. The mustard stain on his tie seemed to heave with his suddenly rapid breathing. He turned slowly toward his computer monitor. The clacking of his thick fingers on the keyboard sounded like dry bones rattling. He was typing her name. Hayes Josephine. Bradley the rookie looked physically ill. The peppermint scent of his gum had soured, mixing with the smell of his own nervous sweat. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, his squeaking rubber soles loud against the dirty linoleum. "Mitch," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Mitch, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Brad." Mitchell snapped, though the bluster was leaking out of him fast. He looked at Briggs. "Sarge, tell me this is a joke. Tell me she's a mental case." Briggs didn't answer. The pale blue light from the computer monitor washed over his face, draining the color from his heavy jowls. He scrolled down. Then he stopped. He leaned closer to the screen, his mouth falling open slightly. The reflection in his cheap bifocals showed a Wikipedia page, followed by a Department of Defense official portrait. A woman in a Class A uniform, 4 stars gleaming on her shoulders, rows of ribbons forming a colorful block down her chest, the same intense, uncompromising eyes that were currently staring a hole through his patrolman. "Oh, Jesus," Briggs breathed out. It wasn't a curse. It was a prayer. Josephine stood there in her stocking feet, her wet toes cold against the floor. She felt ridiculous. She felt degraded. But beneath the humiliation, a terrible, exhausting sorrow began to pool in her chest. She had spent 30 years serving a country that still required her to wear 4 stars to be treated like a human being in a strip mall parking lot. The victory, if you could call it that, tasted like copper and ash. She leaned back against the concrete block wall, ignoring the chill that seeped through her wet clothes. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, listening to the frantic whispered arguing that had broken out between Mitchell and Briggs. It was the sound of a crumbling hierarchy. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt tired, so profoundly tired, and she wanted to go home. Time in the precinct distorted, stretching into a tense, agonizing limbo. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a rhythmic insectoid persistence that made Josephine's head ache. She remained leaning against the cinder block wall, perfectly still, her phone clutched in her right hand. Captain Harris emerged from the back offices. He was a man who looked like he had been poured into his uniform 10 years ago, and had been slowly expanding against the fabric ever since. He smelled of cheap cigars and stale aftershave. He strode into the booking area, wiping sleep from his eyes, annoyed by the sudden hushed chaos. "What is the problem out here, Briggs?" Harris barked, his voice thick with phlegm. "I can hear you 3 panicking through the drywall." Briggs stood up so fast his rolling chair slammed into the filing cabinet behind him. "Captain, sir, we have a situation." He pointed a trembling, ink-stained finger at Josephine. Harris turned. He looked at the disheveled, wet black woman standing in her socks. He frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together in irritation. Who is this, a vagrant? Put her in a holding cell, for God's sake. Don't just leave her standing out here dripping on the floor. She's not a vagrant, Captain. Bradley stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked like he was vibrating. Mitch and I brought her in from the gas go. Failure to comply. Harris looked at Mitchell. So process her and lock her up. Before Mitchell could open his mouth, Josephine pushed off the wall. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Your officers assaulted me, unlawfully detained me, and abandoned my vehicle. And right now your sergeant is trying to figure out how to explain to you that you are currently holding a United States Army general hostage. Harris stopped. He looked back at Briggs. Briggs slowly nodded, turning the monitor so Harris could see. The silence returned heavier this time. Josephine watched Harris's face transition from annoyance to confusion, and finally to a cold, sinking dread. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by the panicked calculations of a bureaucrat realizing his pension was suddenly on fire. "Mom!" Harris started, his voice suddenly stripped of its gruff edges. He took a tentative step toward her, holding his hands up placatingly. "General, let's take a breath here. There's clearly been a massive misunderstanding. Let me get those cuffs, Let me get you a chair. Let's go into my office." "I don't want your chair." "Captain," Josephine said, her voice dripping with ice. "And I certainly do not want to go into your office. I am staying exactly where your men put me." The sound began as a low rumble felt through the soles of her feet before it registered in her ears. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a police siren. It was the heavy synchronized growl of massive diesel engines. Tires screeched outside, stopping abruptly. Heavy doors slammed in rapid succession. The sounds were crisp, disciplined, violent in their precision. The double-glass doors of the precinct were violently shoved open. The damp night air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust. 4 military police officers spilled into the room, moving with an aggressive, coordinated fluidity that made the precinct cops look like sloppy children. They wore full tactical gear, Kevlar vests tight over their uniforms, sidearms holstered, but hands resting near the grips. Behind them walked Major Reynolds. He was JAG, tall, angular, his dress uniform immaculate, despite the hour and the weather. His boots struck the linoleum with sharp, deliberate cracks. He surveyed the room with eyes like chips of flint, instantly assessing the threat level, the positioning, the power dynamics. His eyes locked onto Josephine. He didn't see the wet sweatpants or the messy hair. He saw the rank. Reynolds stopped 3 paces from her, snapped his heels together, and executed a perfect, crisp salute. The MPs instantly mirrored him, freezing in place. "General Hayes." Reynolds barked, his voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. "Major Reynolds, Judge Advocate General's Corps. We have secured the perimeter. We are here to escort you off the premises." Josephine did not return the salute. She couldn't not with her wrists still aching, not with the exhaustion dragging her bones down. She simply nodded. "Thank you, Major." Reynolds turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over Harris, Mitchell, and Bradley. The contempt in his expression was so dense it was almost tactile. "Who is the commanding officer of this facility?" Harris swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I am." "Captain Harris." Reynolds stepped into Harris's personal space. "Captain Harris, you are holding a 4-star general of the United States Armed Forces. You will immediately release her into my custody. You will then preserve all body camera footage, dash cam footage, and holding cell recordings from the past 3 hours. If a single frame of data is corrupted or goes missing, the Department of Justice will dismantle this precinct brick by brick. Mitchell finally snapped. The humiliation was too much for his brittle ego. Hey, wait a minute. She was acting suspicious. She refused a lawful order. You can't just barge in here and... One of the MPs, a massive sergeant with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, took a half step forward, his hand dropping definitively to his holster. The movement was slight, but the threat was deafening. Mitchell choked on his words, stepping back so fast he nearly tripped over his own boots. Josephine walked past Mitchell. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the rookie who was quietly crying near the filing cabinet. She stopped in front of Major Reynolds. "My shoes," she said quietly. Reynolds looked at her stocking feet, a muscle in his jaw twitching with repressed fury. He turned back to the booking desk. "Give the General her shoelaces. Now." Briggs scrambled his hands, shaking so violently he dropped the laces twice before shoving them across the counter. Josephine bent down, fighting the agonizing spasm in her back, and threaded the laces through her damp sneakers. She tied them slowly, methodically. When she stood up, she looked at Captain Harris. "Your men didn't arrest me. Because I was suspicious," she said, her voice echoing in the dead quiet of the room. "They arrested me because I didn't tremble when they shined a light in my face. Teach them the difference, Captain, before they pull over someone who doesn't have an army to call." She turned and walked out through the double glass doors, the military police forming a tight, impenetrable wedge around her. The cold rain hit her face, washing away the smell of the precinct, leaving only the bitter scent of wet asphalt and survival. Raindrops sounded like scattered gravel hitting the reinforced armor of the military Suburban. Inside the cabin was a pressurized vault of tactical efficiency. It smelled of gun oil, clean leather, and the faint, ozone-like scent of a high-grade communication system humming in the center console. Josephine sat in the back row, staring out the tinted window at the blurred streaks of suburban streetlights. The heater was running full blast, blowing hot, dry air over her soaked sneakers. She was shivering. It wasn't the cold, it was the adrenaline crash. Her body, having maintained a state of absolute, rigid readiness for the past 2 hours, was finally realizing the threat had passed. The result was a deep, involuntary tremor that started in her core and radiated out to her fingertips. Major Reynolds sat in the passenger seat, turned slightly backward to keep her in his line of sight. He offered her a thick wool tactical blanket. She took it without a word, pulling it tight around her damp shoulders. The rough texture was grounding. "General," Reynolds said softly, the harsh edge he'd used in the precinct entirely absent. "I have a medical team on standby at Belvoir. We can bypass your residence and go straight to the clinic." "No." Josephine rubbed her left thumb over her right wrist. The skin there was raised, tender, and burning with a dull, persistent heat. "I want to go to the gas station. My car is still there." Reynolds hesitated. "Ma'am, with respect, we can have a recovery detail flatbed the vehicle to your home. You don't need to..." "Major?" She didn't raise her voice. She just let the exhaustion bleed into it. "I'm going to get my car." He held her gaze for a half-second before nodding to the driver. "Reroute to the gas Engo. Defensive formation." The convoy of 3 black SUVs made a tight, illegal U-turn over a grassy median, the heavy tires tearing deep tracks into the mud. When they pulled into the flickering, sodium-lit parking lot of the gas station, the Volvo was exactly where she had left it. The driver's side door was unlocked. The contents of her glove compartment were scattered across the passenger seat: registration papers, old napkins, a tire pressure gauge. A violation rendered in mundane debris. 2 MPs stepped out into the rain rifles, held in a low-ready position, scanning the empty lot, while a third inspected the undercarriage of the wagon with a flashlight. It was absurd. It was theatrical. It was precisely the kind of overwhelming force she had spent her career commanding, now deployed to protect a 2014 station wagon. "Vehicle is clear. General, the lead MP radioed." Josephine threw off the blanket and opened the heavy armored door. The cold air hit her again, but she ignored it. She walked to the Volvo, her legs feeling hollow, like they belonged to someone else. Reynolds followed closely, holding an umbrella over her head that she didn't ask for. She slid into the driver's seat. The fabric was damp. She put the key in the ignition, and the engine sputtered to life with a familiar, reassuring rattle. "I'll trail you," Reynolds said, leaning down to the window. "Bumper to bumper." She nodded and rolled the window up. Driving home, flanked by armored vehicles, Josephine felt the profound, crushing weight of isolation. She was a 4-star general. She had the Pentagon on speed dial. She had heavily armed men willing to tear a police station down to the studs for her. But sitting alone in her car, the ghost of Officer Bradley's tight grip still burning her wrist, she was just a black woman who had survived a Tuesday night. Her house in Alexandria was dark when they arrived. It was a sterile, overly tidy place. No pets, a few neglected houseplants. The kind of home belonging to someone who spent 300 days a year living out of duffel bags and secure facilities. She waved off Reynolds' offer to clear the house, walked inside, and locked the deadbolt. The silence of the hallway was deafening. It rang in her ears, competing with the thumping ache in her lower back. She dropped her keys on the marble counter. They sounded like a gunshot. She walked upstairs to the bathroom and turned on the harsh vanity lights. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her hair was a tangled, wet mess. The grey roots she normally kept meticulously dyed were stark against her dark scalp. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin underneath them bruised with fatigue. Slowly, painfully, she pulled the wet hoodie over her head. She looked down at her wrists. The bruises had blossomed into violent shades of plum and black. They wrapped completely around the joint, perfectly circular, a physical brand of her encounter with local law enforcement. Josephine pressed a finger to the darkest spot on her left arm. A sharp, localized pain shot up to her elbow. She didn't flinch. She just stared at the ugly marks, feeling a sudden, acidic surge of bile in her throat. She turned the shower on, twisting the dial until the water was scalding. She stepped in, letting the heat punish her skin, letting the steam fill her lungs. She scrubbed her arms, her neck, her chest with a rough loofah, trying to wash away the smell of wet wool, cheap peppermint gum, and the lingering sour stench of the precinct holding area. She scrubbed until her skin was raw and pink, but she couldn't wash off the memory. She leaned her forehead against the wet tile, closed her eyes, and finally blessedly allowed herself to cry. It wasn't a graceful release. It was an ugly, hacking sob that tore out of her throat, echoing off the porcelain, a mourning for the invulnerability she thought she had earned, and the devastating realization that she never truly had it at all. Morning light cut through the blast-proof windows of the E-ring, casting long, sharp shadows across Josephine's mahogany desk. The Pentagon air filtration system hummed a steady white noise constant that usually helped her focus. Today, it just felt oppressive. She wore her Class A uniform. The green fabric was perfectly pressed, the creases sharp enough to draw blood. The 4 silver stars on her shoulders gleamed under the recessed lighting. She had spent 20 minutes carefully applying a heavy layer of theatrical concealer to her wrists before buttoning her cuffs tight to restrict any movement that might expose the bruised flesh beneath. She had taken 3 ibuprofen. Her back still screamed. Captain Miller, her aide-de-camp, stood at parade rest by the door. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes betrayed a simmering, protective rage. He had seen the preliminary report from JAG. "They're here, General," Miller said quietly. Chief Weber, the city attorney, and a representative from the police union. "Send them in," Josephine replied, not looking up from the briefing folder in front of her. The door opened. Chief Weber walked in first. He was a small, wiry man in a suit that looked expensive, but fit poorly. He was sweating. The city attorney, a woman clutching a thick leather briefcase to her chest, like a shield, followed close behind. The union rep stayed near the door, looking deeply uncomfortable. None of them had ever been inside the Pentagon, let alone in the office of a combatant commander. They looked at the heavy wooden furniture, the classified screens powered down on the walls, and the intimidating block of ribbons on Josephine's chest. They were out of their depth, and they knew it. "General Hayes." Chief Weber started his voice a half octave too high. He extended a hand across the desk. Josephine let it hang there. She looked at his hand, then up to his eyes. She didn't move. After a humiliating 3 seconds, Weber slowly pulled his hand back, wiping the palm on his trousers. "Have a seat," she commanded. It wasn't an invitation. They scrambled into the heavy leather chairs opposite her desk. The leather squeaked under their shifting weight. "General, I want to start by offering my most sincere, profound apologies." Weber rushed out, leaning forward. "What happened last night was a complete breakdown of protocol. It was unacceptable. Officers Mitchell and Bradley have been suspended pending a full internal affairs investigation. We are prepared to offer a public statement of regret, and the city is ready to discuss a generous settlement to avoid any further unpleasantness." Josephine leaned back in her chair. She steepled her fingers, resting her chin on her hands. The cuffs of her uniform dug into her swollen wrists, sending a sharp spike of pain up her arms. She used the pain to anchor herself, to keep her voice perfectly, terrifyingly flat. "A breakdown of protocol," Josephine repeated, tasting the corporate sterility of the phrase. "Chief Weber, your officers didn't forget to file a form. They profiled me. They escalated a non-existent situation. They physically assaulted me, unlawfully detained me, and mocked me. They did this because they believed they could do it with absolute impunity." The city attorney cleared her throat. "General, we recognize the severity of the situation. However, the officers assert that you were uncooperative and refused a lawful order to exit the vehicle." Josephine's eyes snapped to the attorney. "I asked for the legal justification for the order, a right guaranteed to me by the Constitution I have sworn my life to defend. An order is not lawful simply because a man with a badge and a gun shouts it. If you are going to sit in my office and defend their actions, we can end this meeting right now and let the Department of Justice take over." The attorney paled and shrunk back into her chair. No, please," Weber interjected, shooting a panicked look at his lawyer. "There is no defense. We've reviewed the body camera footage. It's damning. They were entirely in the wrong." "Have you?" Josephine asked softly. She reached forward and tapped a button on her keyboard. The large monitor mounted on the wall to their right flared to life. It didn't show a spreadsheet or a map of a conflict zone. It showed the shaky high-definition feed of Officer Bradley's body camera. The audio filled the room. The sound of the rain, the aggressive crunch of boots on gravel, and then Mitchell's voice, barking out. "Now!" The video showed Bradley grabbing Josephine's arm. It showed the violent, clumsy yank backward. It recorded the sharp gasp of pain she hadn't been able to suppress. Weber squeezed his eyes shut. The union rep looked at the floor. Josephine paused the video on a frame where she was pressed against the roof of her Volvo Rain, plastering her hair to her face, her hands shoved behind her back. "Look at that," Josephine ordered. Her voice cracked like a whip. "Look at it." Weber forced his eyes open. "You aren't apologizing because your men did this," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You are apologizing because of who they did it to. You are sitting here sweating in your cheap suit because you pulled over a 4-star general. If I had been a nurse, coming off a double shift, or a teacher, or a mother buying medicine for her kid, you wouldn't be in this room. You would be rubber-stamping their use of force report and telling me I should have just complied. Weber opened his mouth to protest, but he had nothing. The truth of her words sucked the air out of the room. I don't want your public statement, Josephine continued, leaning forward. And I don't want your city's money. Here is what is going to happen. Officers Mitchell Bradley and Captain Harris will resign by the end of the day. They will surrender their certifications. They will never wear a badge in any jurisdiction in this country ever again. The union rep finally spoke up, his voice gravelly. General, you can't just strip them of their pensions without due process. The union won't allow. I have the Judge Advocate General of the United States Army, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and the Governor of Virginia currently waiting on my next phone call. Josephine interrupted, not even looking at the man. If those 3 resignations are not on my desk by 1700 hours, I will make this city the epicenter of a federal investigation that will gut your department from the precinct level up. I will personally ensure that every arrest Mitchell and Bradley have ever made is audited. I will burn your precinct down with paperwork and subpoenas. Am I understood? The silence that followed was suffocating. The hum of the air filtration system seemed incredibly loud. Yes, General, Weber whispered. He looked like a man who had just watched his house slide off a cliff. Get out of my office. Josephine broke eye contact, pulling a file folder toward her. Captain Miller will escort you out. They stood up quickly, eager to escape the crushing gravity of the room. As the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, Josephine let out a long, shuddering breath. She unbuttoned her right cuff and rolled the sleeve up an inch, exposing the angry purple ring. She had won. The careers of the men who humiliated her were over. But as she stared at the bruised flesh, she felt no vindication. The victory was hollow, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. She had amputated a symptom, but the disease remained waiting in the dark for the next invisible woman to drive through a parking lot at 2 a.m. 5 o'clock arrived exactly on schedule. Captain Miller knocked twice on her heavy office door before stepping inside, carrying a manila folder. He didn't speak. He just walked to her desk, placed the folder squarely on the green blotter, and took a half-step back, assuming parade rest. Josephine stared at the pale cardboard. It smelled faintly of toner ozone and recycled paper. She reached out with her right hand. Her fingers felt stiff, the joints resisting the command to move. Pulling the cover back, she found 3 single-page documents. Resignations. Signed, dated, and legally binding. Mitchell's signature was jagged, the black ink, pressing so hard into the paper, it left a physical indentation she could feel through the back of the page. Bradley's was small, cramped into the bottom corner, like an afterthought from a man trying to disappear. Harris's was a messy, sprawling scrawl that screamed of a bureaucrat signing away his pension under extreme career-ending duress. None of it felt like justice. Justice would mean this never happened in the first place. This was just consequence. Will there be anything else, General Bss? Miller asked quietly. He was young, idealistic, a West Point graduate who still fiercely believed the uniform acted as an impenetrable magical shield against the ugliness of the civilian world. He had learned differently today, and the disillusionment hung heavy in his posture. No, Captain, Josephine said, closing the folder and sliding it into her outbox. The slap of the cardboard was final. Go home, get some sleep. Yes, ma'am. Good night. Leaving the Pentagon took another 40 minutes. Security checkpoints, Heavy steel doors, the endless sterile subterranean corridors that always smelled faintly of floor wax and stale coffee. By the time she reached her reserved parking space, twilight had bruised the Virginia sky, a deep bruised purple and industrial grey. Rain had stopped entirely, but the humidity clung to the air like a wet, suffocating towel. Josephine unlocked her Volvo. The interior still harbored the ghost of that terrifying night, a lingering phantom scent of wet wool, cheap peppermint gum, and the acidic spike of her own adrenaline trapped in the worn upholstery. She started the engine. The radio flickered to life, automatically playing a low, murmuring NPR broadcast about global interest rates. She reached out and snapped it off. She just wanted the silence. Driving through Alexandria, the streetlights began to flicker on one by one, casting long, rhythmic, sweeping shadows across the dashboard. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent, agonizing ache that synced perfectly with the rotation of her tires on the damp asphalt. She flexed her hands on the steering wheel. The stiff, starched cuffs of her uniform jacket rubbed against the swollen, tender skin of her wrists. Every small movement of her hands was a bright, sharp physical reminder of cold steel and absolute powerlessness. 4 blocks from her house, she saw the glowing red neon sign of a 24-hour pharmacy reflecting in the puddles. Turn signals clicked loudly in the quiet cabin as she pulled into the lot. It was almost entirely empty, save for a rusted pickup truck idling near the dark green dumpsters. She turned off the engine and sat there for a long moment, watching a massive moth batter itself repeatedly against the glowing glass of the storefront, driven entirely by blind instinct. Getting out of the car required conscious, monumental effort. Her joints felt rusted, cemented, in place by the accumulated toxic stress of 36 hours without real sleep. Automatic doors slid open with a rattling metallic sigh, blasting her with aggressively conditioned air that smelled heavily of artificial pine and cheap industrial laundry detergent. The store was painfully bright. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead with a sickly vibrating frequency, casting a shadowless, exhausted glare over aisles of discounted toothpaste and faded greeting cards. Walking down the medicine aisle, she felt the heavy, unnatural drag of her polished dress shoes on the scuffed linoleum. She was still in her Class A uniform. The ribbons on her chest caught the harsh light, glinting with decades of service, sacrifice, and authority. A young stock boy, elbows deep in a cardboard box of generic shampoo, stopped what he was doing and stared openly at her, his mouth slightly open. Josephine ignored him entirely. She stopped in front of the pain relievers. Hundreds of brightly colored boxes screamed competing promises of instant relief. She reached out and grabbed the largest plastic bottle of generic ibuprofen she could find. The pills rattled loudly synthetically in her hand. Heading to the checkout, she bypassed the self-service kiosks and walked toward the single open register. A woman in a faded blue smock stood behind the counter, flipping mindlessly through a glossy tabloid magazine. She looked up, chewing lazily on a piece of gum, her eyes glazed with the profound boredom of the night shift. "Just this," Josephine said, placing the plastic bottle on the scratched scanner glass. Scanning the barcode produced a sharp electronic beep that pierced her headache. "That's $8.42. The cashier didn't look at her uniform. She didn't look at the heavy silver stars on her shoulders or the imposing command insignia. She just looked at the glowing green total on her digital screen. Reaching into her pocket, Josephine pulled out a crumpled $10 bill and handed it over. She waited in silence while the woman slowly counted out the change, placing the cold silver coins onto the counter instead of dropping them into her open palm. Picking up the bottle, Josephine walked back out into the heavy, humid night. Sitting in the driver's seat of her Volvo, she didn't immediately start the engine. She peeled the thick plastic safety seal off the bottle with her thumbnail. It was incredibly stubborn fighting her, until it finally tore free with a sudden, violent snap. She shook 3 thick white pills into her palm. Swallowing them dry, she leaned her head back against the headrest. The rough fabric scratched against her scalp. She had broken 3 men today. She had wielded the terrifying, monolithic, unyielding power of the United States military to completely crush the petty, arrogant tyrants who had tried to degrade her in the dirt. In the sterile, secure halls of the Pentagon, she was a titan. She was a force of nature. Yet out here, in the damp, lonely, sodium-lit parking lot of a suburban pharmacy, she was just an exhausted, middle-aged woman waiting desperately for the cheap pills to kick in. Tomorrow morning, she would confidently brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff on complex troop deployments in Eastern Europe. She would make split-second decisions that shifted millions of dollars and thousands of human lives across the globe. But tonight, she just had to survive the 10-minute drive home, lock her deadbolt, and put bags of frozen peas on her battered wrists. Staring out the rain-streaked windshield, she watched a pair of headlights suddenly sweep across the asphalt as another car pulled aggressively into the lot. Her breath hitched in her throat. A cold, involuntary spike of pure adrenaline hit her chest, entirely bypassing her rational, highly trained mind. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel in a white-knuckled death grip before her eyes adjusted, and she realized it was just a teenager in a beat-up civilian sedan. Closing her eyes, she forced her hands to open. She forced her lungs to expand against the tight band of anxiety in her ribs. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. She wasn't broken, but she was fundamentally, irrevocably bruised. And she knew, with a cynical, terribly heavy certainty, that no amount of stars pinned to her collar